So this is a lecture being delivered by Todd Shaw, professor at University of South Carolina in political science, for the class POLI 402 AFAM 402s, the fall 2016 semester. Topic 1, Introduction to Black Political Thought. And so what I'm doing in this lecture, or the points I'm raising in this videotape lecture, is a continuation of points raised in previous points of this lecture. This is the last third of this lecture, given that I have completed 2/3 of it. But what I decided, since time is running out, class, is to take this for you to be able to review at your convenience, and then we'll come back to these points at a later point in the class. So what are we going to talk about in this last third? Well, if you recall, we started off by discussing various working definitions of Black political thought, of political philosophy more broadly, of the public sphere, of concepts such as common fate, and and political ideology. So we raised various concepts, and now, after having also laid out what I call sort of those 7 philosophical principles of Black political thought, and you'll recall that those principles entail the following. They entail the concept of resistance, of representation, of relevance, of responsibility, of reinterpretation, of reclamation, and of reverence. Well, now what I'm going to do, given that we've completed up to this point in the lecture, I'm going to complete the last several points in the lecture, including giving a few more examples of the aspects of the philosophical principles, particularly the principle of resistance and the various sources of Black ideology. Then reinforce the relevance principle and a discussion of the concept of praxis or Black praxis, theory as applied to practice, as you recall from the Jones reading. And then representation and the diversity of the Black experience. Then I'll conclude with an overview of the various schools of political thought, of African American political thought. Okay, so let's now turn to further examples from the 7 philosophical principles. And I want to give you sort of what I'm calling 3 more examples of resistance and the sources of Black ideology is just one example. So now let's take 3 traditions in the Western tradition and discuss how African Americans have used these traditions as a source of resistance, or they may have, in the thinking that we provided earlier, they may have reinterpreted these traditions in certain ways. But I will also say that they've challenged these traditions or try to go beyond these traditions. Let's first take the tradition of liberalism. So when I talk about liberalism, I don't mean ideological liberal from liberal on the left or conservative on the right. This use of the word, liberalism, I mean the liberty-oriented tradition. The liberty-oriented tradition, a tradition rooted in notions of individual liberty. And this is a sort of core principle within Western democratic thinking. But in particular, we could call upon the thinking of John Locke, L-O-C-K-E, who is known as one of those parents of the English Enlightenment. particularly in England of the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Now, for political science students, political philosophy students, you very likely know that John Locke wrote the Second Treatise on Government. And in the Second Treatise on Government, he made several basic claims about what we come to know as sort of this liberal tradition. He says, first of all, that natural human rights exist. You know, the idea that the self-evident principle that there are certain God-given inalienable rights, as Jefferson and others would place into the Declaration of Independence. So these human rights are fundamental, they're natural, and they exist. Individual liberty and freedom are the highest ideals to be preserved. So that one's individual freedom or individual guarantees of freedom as found in the Bill of Rights, in the U.S. constitutional framework, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, all of those freedoms being core to this political conception. Thirdly, political communities must be founded on the consent of the governed, that a consensual government, or small r republican government, a government of representation, of consent, of understanding the democratic majority's will is critically important. And this is critically important. Fourthly, that property is the basis for political union. Earlier on, John Locke gave a triad of principles that Thomas Jefferson would slightly tweak, but Locke said that we must be mindful of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Well, Thomas Jefferson, as you know, switched that around a little bit and used the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so that's just a very basic primer in liberalism. Now, one fundamental problem, of course, with liberalism is that in the liberal tradition practice, of course, in the United States and in the West, among European nations in particular, is that you might have these core notions of liberty, but these also have been nations that have, you know, in the U.S. and in Great Britain's case in particular, have practiced slavery, the enslavement of African Americans, or the enslavement of Africans who became African Americans or Afro-Caribbeans, etc. And the sort of colonial exploitation of that trade. In fact, Locke himself was the secretary to the Crown's Colonial Board. So he knew of and was directly, in some ways indirectly, engaged in the African slave trade, particularly, and he had extensive interest in the British East India Company. But it was Locke who wrote about, in a sort of theoretical sense, the problem of enslavement or slavery, not in the real sense, but in the theoretical sense. And beyond Locke, we know the framers of the Constitution made certain compromises within that Constitution, as James Madison would point out, that permitted the continuance of slavery alongside the enshrining these principles of a Republican democratic government for those who were considered citizens, you know, and in this particular case in America's history is white male property owners. Well, because of this struggle, the Supreme Court Associate Justice Thurgood Marshall, the first African American to serve upon the Supreme Court, would talk about that there was a sort of original flaw to the Constitution, if you will, almost sort of an original sin to the Constitution in permitting slavery or slavery along some broader notions of liberty and democracy. And so that, you know, the 14th Amendment, the Civil War, had to correct this original sin, if you will. And then in addition, African Americans have had to struggle with this liberal tradition. And whether we're talking about Frederick Douglass's eloquent speech at Corinthian Hall, when in 1852 he would ask the question, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? To the thinking of Martin Luther King, of Fannie Lou Hamer, from a list of other African American political voices who would raise the question of these contradictions within the American liberal tradition. And the big contradiction being the problem that on one side you have this discussion of individual liberty and individual rights, but we know racism is not pitted upon individual characteristics, but it is a group form of oppression. And so African Americans have had to challenge and reinterpret that liberal tradition. Another second tradition that might have provided a sense of resistance, but is also needed to be a source of reinterpretation, is the ideology of Marxism, the political thought of Marxism. And, there's an entire class one could give about any one of these particular schools of thought, but Marxism, we'll just simply have to say that we'll use Karl Marx, the German philosopher of the 19th century. He was an economic historian and a political economist, and particularly wrote that important tome, Das Kapital. We'll use sort of some principles from Marxist thinking to represent sort of orthodox or standard or classical Marxism, if you will, which would be the basis for communist thought. So here's a couple of assumptions of Marxism. That history is a dialectical process, or in other words, history is a conflictual process that progresses from one state to the next. Capitalism is a historical development that naturally flows from the human processes and forces of production. Capital accumulation is derived through labor-wage exchange and the central motor of capitalism. And there you have various classes within the capitalist structure, from the bourgeoisie, the ownership class, to the proletariat, the working class, and that they each have historical responses and statuses relative to the changing needs of production, and that class conflict is a necessary tension to move history forward, that ultimately the proletariat will become the democratic and dominant class in a communist society. Now, there are various ways in which African Americans and African thinkers have borrowed upon Marxism, and we're going to talk more about this in depth. But there are a couple of key struggles within Marxist thought that African and African American thinkers have brought about revision or challenges. One of them being the question, and I'll just state a principal contradiction. I won't go through them all. One of them being that is there an insistence by certain Marxists that class oppression supersedes all other forms of oppression, including racial oppression. That racism or slavery is simply a manifestation of class oppression. And if we fundamentally create a tension that brings about revolution and overthrowing class oppression, we will do away with racial oppression. Well, there were a host of African American thinkers who would challenge this. Certainly, there's thinkers within the African world, George Padmore being among them, a revision by the first president of independent Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, in his reworking sort of Pan-Africanism and combining it with Marxism. And the Black Panther Party as well challenged a certain historical interpretation of that said Marxism was only class oppression as opposed to class and racial oppression, or these intersecting oppressions. So that's form of resistance, but also a form of reinterpretation. And then lastly, postmodernism. Now, postmodernism is really a multitude of things, but as simply, a very simple explanation for it would be, it is everything that is the opposite of modernity, of what is modern. Like Marxism, it has many schools of thought, but its parent figures include French philosophers such as Jacques Derrida, Michael Foucault, and German philosophers such as Martin Heidegger and Friedrich Nietzsche. Postmodernism asserts a couple of things. One, that no ultimate truth should be sought at the expense of the beauty of uncertainty, complexity, and chaos. Any notion of authority or authoritative knowledge or knowable facts must be rejected for complete individual freedom and interpretation. Modern notions of technological advancement must be rejected for the ideas of pre-technology, tradition, and mysticism. And some would argue or debate about when did the modern period of Western civilization begin versus this challenge of postmodernism. Some suggest that the modern age began during the European Renaissance that was followed by postmodernism shortly after. Others argue that it was in the late 1960s and early 1970s is the best demarcation between the modern and the postmodern era that we live. Postmodernism most often uses literary terms like author, text, reader, discourse, and subject in its vocabulary. And thus those in cultural studies and literatures in the field of literature have most directly embraced it. There are several individuals who have revised postmodernism, used it as a sense of resistance, if you will. Cornel West, in some broad respect, has borrowed from postmodernist thinking, as has legal and critical race scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, or Patricia Hill Collins as a black feminist thinker, as well as bell hooks. But they are clear that even though they may argue about the need for complexity and deconstruction, that they understand how race and gender and these other oppressions are unitary oppressions, and that that there is an important deviation they would make in saying that you have to understand these very structured, group-based oppressions that, although they have complex elements, must be understood and not simply deconstructed for the sake of deconstruction. Okay, now let me talk about African influences on black political thought, and we're not going to go into great detail because actually that's the subject of the next section. But it is important to keep in mind that, and I'm showing you here pictures of three individuals who've had a very broad impact upon African and African American political thought. By the way, this was Michel Foucault, and this was Karl Marx, John Locke. On this side is Edward Wilmot Blyden. We'll discuss Blyden in the next section. Amy Jacques Garvey, and Cheikh Anta Diop. In each of these cases, it's important to just keep in mind the ways in which both this desire for African Americans to reach back to an African past, as well as the effort to borrow from African philosophical thinking, has been key to black political thought. And we're certainly going to expound upon that when we get to our discussion of Afrocentrism. That's all I'll say about that for now. Now, as we go into a discussion about other questions, particularly questions of relevance, I want to present a quote here by the social and cultural historian Harold Cruse, and we talked about Cruse earlier on in this lecture. Cruse states in the 1967 book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, the Negro intellectual must deal intimately with the white power structure and cultural apparatus, and the inner realities of the black world at one and the same time. But in order to function successfully in this role, he, the Negro intellectual, has to be acutely aware of the nature of the American social dynamic and how it monitors the ingredients of class stratifications in American society. The functional role of the Negro intellectual demands he cannot be absolutely separated from either the black or white world. And keep in mind, I said that one of Cruse's key criticisms of black intellectuals is that they lacked relevance, a connection to the African American community that is meaningful. So let's talk about relevance in the black practices and discuss Cruse as well as black folk culture as a source. Now, again, as I said, Harold Cruse for many years was a professor at the uh, University of Michigan. His important tome, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, was this 700-page book that became to many a sort of Bible of the Black Power era. And in many respects, Cruz took up a criticism of the Black intellectuals uh, as part of the Black Power era because he wanted to directly challenge the thinking of the civil rights generation and those within the civil rights generation who he argued were too entirely concerned about integration and breaking down the barriers as put up by Jim Crow to really kind of think through what did it mean to be um, a fully actualized and empowered African American community. So in Cruz's book, Cruz is from an ideological standpoint, from a standpoint of political ideology, I would say Cruz was a bit of a Black nationalist. Now he's what I would call a Black community nationalist, and we will explain that later. But in a real sense, Cruz was not necessarily trying to seek autonomy and nationhood away from white America at the exclusion and complete separation of Black America from white America, but he wanted to harness the internal cultural and political power of Black America for its benefit. And so he was critical of artists such as the novelist Richard Wright, or the playwright Lorraine Hansberry, the poet and author James Baldwin, and the singer and activist Paul Robeson, for them not seeing the need for a form of sort of nationalism, of political nationalism. Now, here's a couple of assumptions of the crisis of the Negro intellectual. He says cultural politics are a necessity for empowerment. What does he mean? The consideration of culture and cultural politics is central to the creation of Black liberation. And Black intellectuals have neglected historical analysis of the truth because they do not really understand the importance of culture and cultural politics. You know, literature, art, film, all of the ways in which culture fundamentally shapes people's sense of self. Cruz is one who would reject that notion, that classic notion of liberalism I just explained. Cruz believed in American society, there's no such thing as individuals. There is no American identity in Cruz's thinking. American society is only segregated into groups. The individual is shaped and defined according to the status of his group in America's so-called cultural democracy. Thirdly, Cruz believed there were three dominant white ethnic groups. These three groups, which comprise the dominant political class, the dominant patrons, and those who were the patrons of culture and of art in the U.S., these three groups were WASP, or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, Catholics, and to a lesser extent, Jews. Yet Cruz was real clear. He said the Anglo-Saxon majority, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority, was the superior group among all three. Then he would argue that the intellectual ought to be a cultural mediator. He says, given that there is such great segregation among all ethnic groups, the intellectual in his world is a cultural mediator between her group and the mainstream society. And then I'll offer one other important point from Cruz's work. The failure of the Black middle class to patronize Black folk and popular culture. Cruz is particularly concerned that whites owns and thus legitimate the means of artistic and cultural production in the Black community. They own the hip hop label, or they own the label and the distribution for hip hop albums. They own the copyrights to various plays. They own the vast majority of the television networks that would produce Black dramas and Black comedies. And he says this is due partly to the Black middle class's refusal to really assert its economic leadership and to harness its power to take ownership of black cultural and artistic production. Now, let's turn to black folk culture as a source. And I'm only going to say a little bit about this because, again, our next section is going to go into this in much greater detail. But needless to say, I'm showing you here a picture of the Sankofa bird. I'm showing you a picture of a religious, sacred, cultural practice within the South Carolina Sea Islands and the Low Country that we know as the Ring Shout Circle. And I'm showing you here the two brilliant grassroots activists and leaders within the civil rights movement, Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker. So to ask, what is the source of black thought? Is black thought created by black intellectuals, by the black professional, educated elite class and artistic class? Or is black culture, black blues music, soul music, hip hop and R&B, barbershop and beauty shop discussions, ordinary days with ordinary Sundays with black preachers and black choirs? Are all of these the sources of black political thought? And this is actually a long and contested set of questions within the black cultural experience. At one point, W.E.B. Du Bois was the elder leader who was being challenged by individuals like Langston Hughes and like Zora Neale Hurston, who were arguing that Dr. Du Bois wants his elite version of proper culture to be displayed, as opposed to what we want to display as the sort of the fire and the brilliance and the sassiness of the Harlem Renaissance. So this is a long contested question in black culture and thus in black thought. So let's briefly talk about the politics of representation and the politics and questions and controversies of inclusion. So remember, whereas relevance was about resistance is about, fundamental challenges of oppression, where relevance was about praxis and practical and relatable thoughts and experiences, relative to black freedom. Representation, of course, is about bringing in the diversity of the black experience, of black voices. And we will get into the politics of black representation. But let me give you a few examples that also include questions of race and controversies of inclusion. So the brilliant author and poet and essayist Alice Walker, in her writing her brilliant book, The Color Purple, that became an epic film, widely cited in African American cultural circles, and then became a Broadway play. She had this representation of this figure, Mr. Now, the controversy at the time, particularly with the movie adaptation, was that is Mr. this problematic representation of black manhood, of black males, that he was an abusive, a cold-hearted figure that sexually and verbally abused Celie, as well as other women figures within The Color Purple. And so there was a debate about how positive of a representation is that image of black men. Well, Alice Walker, as well as various other individuals who are feminist or womanist thinkers, would argue it's not about the politics of respectability in the black community. We must provide truthful and candid and fully human portrayals of black life. You can't just simply argue that because it is truthful but it's critical, it shouldn't be seen. We should not sweep these various questions under the rug, but they should be brought to the fore. Questions like rape or domestic violence within African American communities. So that's one example of that sort of politics of representation. Another example more recently is the actor Nate Parker, who himself had fended down charges of a rape allegation many years ago that have recently has surfaced as to whether he adequately made recompense for his actions with regards to this particular case. Now, of course, there's the politics of representation in that on one side, Nate Parker has this questionable history or background with regards to these questions of gender and rape. At the same time, there is the fact that he is the lead actor within a very important historical or biopic of Nat Turner and Nat Turner's Rebellion in the film The Birth of a Nation. So, does the community support the film? Do they support the persons and the women who were victimized by Nate Parker as the actual actor? The politics of what to do around questions of representation are not small questions. Then we could talk about the politics of race and inclusion. So African American conservatives, and in particular African American conservatives, I should be careful to say that, have been supportive, or some individuals have been very supportive of the Trump campaign, even though you have 2% or maybe as high as 8%, but a very small percentage of African Americans supporting Donald Trump, given his odious, his dubious, racial language that and the various sort of exclusionary language he's used. African Americans are not overwhelmingly supportive and are highly critical of Donald Trump, and also are highly critical of African American leaders that might be supportive of Donald Trump. Now, I will argue that this is Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice is not an outspoken proponent of Donald Trump, but she is an African American conservative. Where do African American conservatives sit relative to the black community? Because as we'll see, conservatism is not always, even though Jones makes this claim, conservatives are not always widely embraced within African American communities, partly because of their stances on race and racism. So that's on the right side of the spectrum. On the left side of the spectrum is, of course, the African American LGBT community. And so I'm showing you here, and its questions around inclusion. I'm showing you here the picture of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. with the Smithsonian Institute that will open on September the 24th, 2016. And there will be representations of all of Black America in that museum, including African American LGBT figures and moments in history and in the life of that segment of the community. So, but that is a long struggle, given African American at time social and religious conservatism against various questions around LGBTQ rights. So these are ongoing questions of inclusion and ongoing questions of representation in the Black experience. Okay, so now let's talk about, and I had that long picture of Janet Mott there, but let's talk about the various schools of African American thought, and I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly, but it is important for me to give an overview. So now the particular terms that are in red are the terms or the school of thought that we will more directly and explicitly deal with this semester. Those that are in white are either alternate terms for those schools of thought, as is the case with liberal integrationism, or they are schools of thought that we will reference throughout, but will not have a specific segment on that school of thought, particularly Black masculinist thought or Black political theology. And here I'm representing or I'm presenting pictures of various individuals who would represent corollaries to, or who would represent or who are representatives, pardon me, I'm getting tongue-tied here, of these various schools of thought, whether it be Martin Luther King for liberal integrationism, Angela Davis for Black Marxism and socialism, Janetta Cole for Black feminist and womanist thought, Clarence Thomas for Black conservative thought, Janet Mott for Black LGBTQ thought, Louis Farrakhan with Black nationalism, and I'm showing you here Bishop Vashti McKenzie, the first African American woman elected a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, to represent black political theology, and this book by Jawanza Kunjufu, Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys, as an element of black masculinist thought. But let me discuss those schools of thought we're directly going to reference this semester. All right, and let's first talk about liberal integrationism. So as I say here, it is critical. It's a school of thought that is critical of racism and seeks racial equality and the full inclusion of African Americans into American society. It embraces American liberalism, that classic notion of the liberty-oriented tradition, but from the standpoint of collective deliverance as opposed to individual freedom/liberty. In fact, it's the most highly subscribed and oldest of all black ideologies. This ideology couples a critique of American racism with an impassioned but optimistic plea for America to live up to its liberal creed. And again, it pursues a radical equality, which America truly becomes, both a multiracial and democratic society. The various examples of persons who embrace this ideology might be the journalist Ida B. Wells, the civil rights leader Frederick Douglass, the 1950 civil rights movement up to 1963 in today's Urban League. Okay, black Marxism or socialism. It applies Marxism, communism, or socialism to the black situation, the black experience, the black condition. It believes both racism and capitalism are equal problems. And as I said, that is in part the conflict that black Marxists may have with their white and other counterparts. This ideology adapts the tenets of Marxism to the African American predicament. Adherents of this ideology have often emphasized the political principles of self-determination and the material question of land as fundamental for understanding revolutionary dynamics within the United States, to the disagreement of their white comrades. Because black Marxists view racism and classism as linked depressions, they are often skeptical of alliances with conservative white workers, as classical Marxists might argue, and they are critical of the black bourgeoisie, the black capitalist class. They are equally willing to consider progressive alliance with other classes or other nations. Individuals who are part of this tradition might be Angela Davis, as I'm showing here, Cyril Briggs and the African Brotherhood of the 1930s. W.B. Du Bois by 1963 would consider himself both a Pan-Africanist and a communist. The Black Panther Party of the early 1970s and the Black Radical Congress of the 1990s. All right, black conservatism, and I'm showing you there a picture of Justice Clarence Thomas. Black conservatism de-emphasizes racism as an explanation for the group predicament of African Americans and instead stresses individual hard work and moral development. Now, this ideology de-emphasizes racism as an explanation for the group predicament of African Americans and instead stresses individual work ethic and moral as well as economic development, as I just said, borrowing from contemporary American political conservatism, especially the new conservatism that emerged after Ronald Reagan. The key ideological principles of this ideology are self-help, that's self-help principle, a criticism of state intervention because because the state or government getting involved is seen as taking responsibility away from the individual and retarding social progress, and a belief in the importance of market answers of the market of capitalism to black problems. Booker T. Washington, he would have differed with later conservatives, but he certainly was a black conservative. George Schuyler, the essayist and editorialist of the 1930s, the economic professor Thomas Sowell, the former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, the anti-affirmative action activist Ward Connolly, and the Institute of the New Black Leadership. These are all examples of exemplars of black conservatism. Black feminism and womanism. It believes racism, classism, and sexism are multiple oppression and calls for the full inclusion of black women in the community and in the society. This ideology asserts that sexism, patriarchy, racism are linked in multiple oppressions and can be confronted by African Americans equally accepting the worldviews and leadership of women. Some of the other distinguishing characteristics of black feminism or womanist philosophy include a tendency to see the struggle for African American women as being more holistic and universal than that of other white feminists, and a greater concern for the entire community. They confront the internal dilemma of sexism within the black community versus racism from white feminists. Examples would include Sojourner Truth, Anna Julia Cooper, Barbara Smith, Jonetta Cole, and the 1970s activists of the Combahee River Collective. Combahee River Collective. Combahee River, right here in South Carolina. Then black LGBTQ thought. Like feminism, it challenges multiple oppressions. This school calls for the full the full recognition and inclusion of African Americans and others who self-identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and are questioning into the community and society. This school of thought has at its core, or schools of thought, has as its core a concern over gender oppression and gender in the broad manifestations of that concept. But of course, African American LGBTQ thinkers argue that the multiple oppressions of racism and classism and sexism, as combined with the oppression of homophobia and heterosexism and transphobia, all of these linked oppressions provide for an important front of action in thinking for this community. Various individuals that would be part of the LGBTQ thought and its constellation of thinkers and actors would certainly be Bayard Rustin, as we will discuss. I've formerly discussed Barbara Smith, Audre Lorde, and during the 1980s into the 1990s, the National Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Roundtable became one of a burgeoning number of organizations that represented the African American LGBTQ voice. And then last but not least, black nationalism. It sees race and racism as the central problems of the black predicament and calls for black political, economic, and or cultural independence and autonomy. Sorry, that's going off the screen. Independence and autonomy, and sometimes separation from white America. This is the second oldest and most objectively identified ideology. In other words, you can when you look at various surveys and ask various survey questions, you can discern who would consider themselves a black nationalist, if not by the actual title or name of black nationalism, at least in the principles they observe. Again, as I said, this ideology asserts that race is the fundamental category of political analysis. America is irreparably racist, and black cultural and political autonomy or independence, nationhood, is the answer to this racism. This autonomy implies a black development separate from white America, either within or outside the boundaries of the United States. The fact that Africa holds a special place as the motherland for most black nationalists leads many, but not all, to see people of African descent as spiritual allies of African Americans. In other words, the broader concept of Pan-Africanism. Some strains of black nationalism are in theory open to alliances with other non-white movements. Others reject all such alliances. Of all black ideologies, black nationalism is most inherently anti-liberal school of thought. It is the school of thought most opposed to the concepts embedded within liberalism. Examples of black nationalists, or exemplars of black nationalism, would be Martin Delany, Marcus Garvey, and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, Amy Jacques Garvey, who was also a womanist, Malcolm X before his split with the Nation of Islam in 1964, and the 1980s and 1990s Afrocentricity movement. So having said that, here is a graph or a table that takes data from the 1993-1994 National Black Politics Study conducted by Michael Dawson. What Dawson did in this study, and this study still kind of withstands the test of time in the sense of its importance in black politics. He took a battery of questions that all related to these various schools of thought and ran an analysis to see how did individuals cluster. And again, this is what he did, is he did it across the entire sample of respondents for each school of thought. So that's why these numbers are not going to add to 100. He did the analysis across for each and try to determine where did folk fall. And so he categorized folk either as being true believers, they believed a good majority of the principles, or true haters. They clearly were in opposition to most of the principles. So with black nationalism, 37% of the sample were probably true believers, 4% were true haters. Black feminism, 19% were true believers, 2% true haters. I created this scale because Dawson didn't include this in his original 2001 book, Black Visions. But I included this scale, which I took sort of what we call the filling thermometer scale, and said, well, what percentage of folk were scored in 50 and above and 49 and below? 50 and above, 33% of the sample were warm, and it was the filling thermometer, which said 0, absolutely cold toward gay men, black gay men. 50, kind of neutral. 100, warm or feeling close toward the group. So 33% fell into what I would call the true believers category, or close to true believers, versus 61% true haters. Liberal integrationists, 40% true believers, 2% true haters, and black conservatives, 1% true believers, thus you know how Donald Trump got the percentage he got even today, and 20% true haters. So you can see at the polls, LGBTQ folk and conservatives. LGBTQ folk on the left and conservatives on the right have real problems in attracting African American believers. Okay, so we saw this diagram earlier, and I don't want you to get my diagrams confused, but this diagram is sort of if you remember my concentric circles, this diagram is simply delving down into that little circle of ideology and exploding out sort of the black, what's happening within black communities and black ideology. So remember, this is sort of the African American school of thought diagram, or it's the ideology lens, if you will, in the broader constellation of black thinking, of black political thinking. And so remember that I said the black ideological spectrum runs from liberal on the left, or liberal to revolutionary on the left, to moderate to reformist to status quo conservative on the right. I put, and what I call pluralism, that I mean liberal integrationism there. And nationalism is here. Notice that I put these two schools of thought equally on the left to right axis. Here's the middle that kind of somewhat separates the left from the right. And then, whereas the left stresses political and economic values, the right stresses social and moral values. Racial consciousness, self-determination, or self-help are principles that swing in between the left and the right poles. Do you agree with me? So you have LGBTQ thought, feminism, and socialist thought on the left. Theological thinking somewhat more on the right, as well as conservatism clearly on the right. Decide whether or not you agree with Shaw as to how or me, I'm speaking to myself in the third person, but decide if you agree with me relative to how I construct this particular lens. Then if you go even further out, and so I'm taking even broader cross sections of that lens. We don't go all the way out to the public sphere, but I'm taking even broader cross sections of that lens. Here are the 7 philosophical principles. And I even sort of give it a divide within this particular lens of what's on the sort of African/black side of black identity versus the European versus white side of black identity. Now, what do I mean by that? We'll talk about W.B. Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, but the idea of African Americans are both of African descent and American, and those warring ideals, as Du Bois would say, that sense of double consciousness, it can be a source of strength, but it is also, in Du Bois's view, a source of tension. But here are the principles: resistance, representation, relevance, responsibility, reinterpretation, reclamation, reverence. So those broader principles then shape the schools of thought. So you can refer back to the other diagram. If you think about it, I've sort of taken the lens and flipped it on its side, or you're looking at from a different cross section. I'd ask you the question, well, where's the public sphere? Yep, somewhere out here is where the public sphere is, creating this, then this. And here's essentially the same diagram, but I just flipped it on its side. So here's the left, here's the right. Black political ideology, radical egalitarianism or pluralism, disillusioned liberalism is what Dawson would argue is sort of a transitory, a temporary sense of disillusionment. That they're upset of the prospects that America is not fulfilling its promise, but they don't quite yet know what school of thought to move toward. Some of them move toward black nationalism. Some of them may move toward black Marxism or black feminist or LGBTQ thought. But again, here they are. Here's black nationalism. Here's black masculinist thought that we haven't discussed. And here's black conservatism way over here. And then beyond the lens is what the lens looks at, what the lenses look at. So how do they define, what do they look at, and how do they define the ethical goals of unity, of freedom, of justice, equality, of beauty, of morality, etc. Lastly, when you pose various questions in this class, I want to give you just a tip about how to frame or how to think about the types of questions that you ask. And this will give you some idea about how to ask a good question relative to the assignment. So remember that you ask a question, or you pose questions to the class with your form questions. And so how do you want to frame that question in such a way that you ask a good question? How do you want to answer a question in a good way? Well, there are what I call sort of these 4 critical thinking questions. There's the empirical question, the evidentiary question, the evaluative question, and the ethical question. What's the empirical question? It's a question that simply says, well, what are the facts? What's the description? Well, what did Du Bois say? What did Audre Lorde say? What did they say? In other words, what do black people or some black people think or believe politically? So can you just give us the basic facts and describe what is? The evidentiary question is, okay, prove it to me. How do you know? Give me some sense of evidence, proof, or epistemology, the study of how we know. How do you know, or how do we know what black people think politically? So you make this case of what folk think. How do you know that? Give me the evidence for it. The evaluative question is interpretation or assessment. It weighs the notion of significance. So what do various black people mean when they say? What is the meaning or significance of these ideas or of those ideas? So it's not just giving me the facts and telling me how you know those facts, but it's weighing the facts, interpreting, assessing the facts, evaluating the facts. Then the ethical question is really let's just say it's the highest form of question we want to ask in this class, because it's the question of moral or normative judgment, of prescription, of opinion, of this is the way it ought to be, not the way it just is. What should black people think politically? What political action should they take if they want to serve their own interest? What are their interests? Or what should be their interest, etc.? So this is just a way for you to think about how to frame great questions. Okay, class, I'm going to stop it here. I hope this has been helpful to you, and you can use this lecture as a point of reference as we move ahead in the class. But at the same time, I just wanted to make sure that we flushed out the rest of the lengthy set of topics I presented in topic 1, so that you have everything you need to be able to unpack and understand African American political thought. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.